All right, good morning, economics students. We're going to be looking at our last chapter on prices. This is chapter 4, an overview of prices, where Sol is going to kind of wrap up a lot of the discussions that he got going with kind of understanding the difference between a price system and a command system, and then all of the discussion that we had last time about price controls. So his broad thesis and his broad aim is to distinguish between these two basic kind of fundamental choices in terms of how we allocate resources that have alternate uses, and that's really what he would say is the study of economics. It's not the study of morality. It's not the study of theology. It's the study of scarce resources. Now, one place where I might disagree with him is that I think because the economy is a human institution that is designed and devised for the betterment of man, man is kind of the end of economics. The economy is for man, not man for the economy. So there are moral components to economic decision making. However, um, it would be like saying that we're going to suspend the laws of gravity because I want to try to love my neighbor. I mean, I might want to try to love my neighbor, but if I want to jump, across Little Traverse Bay and I can't fly, I might drown. Okay, so it's not a question of whether morality is, you know, not a component in economic decision making. Morality is a component of any type of human decision that we make. But what his point is that first and foremost, at its fundamental level, economics is about scarcity. It's not about having some goal that you want to accomplish, and to do that you're going to use certain economic concepts. That's what he's trying to kind of disabuse people of. That in some respects, it's even though it's a social science, it's got scientific elements to it that you can't just ignore because you want something to happen. Okay, so that's where he's going with this whole chapter on the overview of prices. So you had you have one Google form assignment from both lectures on Monday. I'm making that due on Wednesday when we have our live session. And then this lecture will have a Google Forms assignment that's due on Thursday. Okay, so kind of trying to spread it out a little bit for you. Okay? All right, so this is again chapter 4, pages 64 to 85. And basically what I'm going to be doing is trying to kind of summarize some of his points and some of the examples that he uses to kind of elucidate and explain some of his points. I think the first one, if you get this kind of definition in your head about scarce allocating resource, right? So what does that mean? That means kind of where should we, how much of resource X should we send here versus there? Let's say, think about ventilators. I mean, I'm wondering, plastic, I'm sure, is a component of making a ventilator. Where does plastic come from? It comes from petroleum that you get out of the ground, which is actually an interesting concept that, petroleum has it's a scarce resource, and it has alternative uses. You can make plastic out of it, but you can also use it to fuel automobiles, so on and so forth. So that scarce that ventilator needs plastic. Well, should we shift all of our petroleum production over to making plastic so we can make more ventilators to solve the coronavirus? That's a choice, right? And so what Sol would say is that we've got two basic systems to make that choice about resources that are scarce and can be used in different ways. You can either let the price system do it, which involves planning, which involves choices, which involves rationing. And the understanding of rationing is that you're going to maybe limit the use of a resource here, limit it here, so you can have more there. So rationing is kind of a reality of a world that has scarce resources. One of the big questions then becomes, or issues, is who does the rationing, or what causes or does the rationing. And a price system is a kind of process and a procedure that is um, created out of individual choices, okay, as opposed to a command system where there's a lot fewer people making that decision. And he's going to have something about at the end of the chapter that talks about just how realistic is it for a few really, really smart people to actually get those economic decisions right. When we have example after example after example where a command system and it's not to say that a price system is perfect, but compare the allocation of resources done by prices versus done by a command system, and he would say that's really not even a fair fight. So anyway, he begins the chapter by talking about what economics is. And he would say that it's an analysis of cause and effect of relationships in an economy. Okay, so it's another way of kind of viewing this idea of scarcity. So if things are scarce and have alternative uses, we got to understand if you do X, then does X cause Y or does X cause Z? And another way of saying that is that economics is designed to discern the consequences of various ways of allocating scarce resources with alternative uses. So, what is the consequence of using this, of having X cause Y, right? And so, should we have less of X or more of Y or more of Z? It's not about, he would say morality or love or humor or anger. In the first instance, it's about this issue of allocating resources. Next, he starts talking about cause and effect. In fact, I'll just kind of put this up here. Sorry, I forgot that. Economics is an analysis of cause and effect relationships in an economy. It's to discern the consequences of various ways of allocating scarce resources with alternative uses. Okay? So to dig down a little bit in terms of cause and effect, he would say that examining the logic of the incentives that are being created in certain economic actions is a key aspect of understanding why things cause other things. So he brings in this whole idea of incentives. What causes people to act in a certain way? And causation in an economy is not one way, but he would say it results in it's a result of systemic interactions. Another way of saying that from a social science perspective is that instead of having one variable cause a phenomenon, it's multi-variable, right? And so when something, it's not like I think he uses the example of a billiard ball. If I'm lining up my cue ball and I hit the cue ball into the one ball and put it in the side pocket, what happened? Cue ball caused one ball to go into corner pocket. That is a one-way variable relationship. But let's say you take a cue ball and you hit it into like 7 different balls. And so now the 1 is hitting the 9, the 9 is hitting the 5, and the 5 is hitting the 12, and and then maybe there was spin on the ball, and so there's all sorts of reasons why maybe something happened, and that the 8 ball went into the side pocket and you lose the game. Okay, so economics is mostly about complex reciprocal relationships and not one-way interactions. In other words, there are systems that have multiple interactions within them. It's usually not one way. And part of the reason why a lot of people misunderstand economics is they get wrong really basic fundamental facts. They almost want to ignore them because if they do, it allows them maybe to pursue their goals or their dreams. Okay? So again, causation in an economy is not one way, but a result of systemic interactions. Okay? So, talking about system and causation, we have systemic causation. He would say that often economic actions are not caused by intentional action. So I get up in the morning. Well, I guess I did cut my hair, so that was intentional. Okay, but in a lot of economic phenomenon, um, things occur not because I intend something to happen, but because of a whole host of other variations. Maybe I intended to do something, but then somebody else intended to do something else, and those things kind of get mixed up, and then you roll the dice and you end up getting a different result. Okay, he uses the example of high prices in low-income neighborhoods, and he would say that a lot of people would argue that the reason for that is greed, racism, predatory pricing. There's lots of different ways that we talk about that, and that doesn't mean that there isn't racism and that there isn't greed in human society. Well, what he would say is that just saying that that one cause is creating that one effect is entirely simplistic. So he gives the example of, you don't have a lot of banks in low-income neighborhoods. You have basically check cashing operations where people can, cash their paychecks, Social Security checks, and all of the rest. That there's actually not a lot of grocery stores in low-income neighborhoods and the like. And so here's just a little bit of what he says. He says, higher prices for people who can least afford them are a tragic end result, but the causes are systemic. It's not intentional, and it's not just one individual or one cause. This is not merely philosophical or semantic. There are major practical consequences to the way causation is understood. Treating the causes of higher prices and higher interest rates in low-income neighborhoods as being personal greed or exploitation, and trying to remedy it by imposing price controls and interest rate ceilings only ensures that even less will be supplied to people living in low-income neighborhoods. And so he would say that basically the reason why is that there's more risk in operating a business in a low-income neighborhood, partly having to do with crime, having to do with shoplifting, vandalism. Okay, and this has nothing to do with race, for example. Actually, Thomas Sowell is an African American economist, and there's poor people living in rural white, quote unquote, white America. But what he would say is that if you live in a low income neighborhood, the tendency is to have those kinds of incidents occur at a higher rate in a place that has more affluent citizens. And the result is it's tragic, but you're going to end up having higher prices for goods because if you're running a business, those are costs that you have to bear. And higher policing, higher security systems, cameras, and those things cost money, and they're going to be passed along to the consumer. And one of the things that maybe will happen is that a business will just decide not to conduct business in that area to begin with. Okay, so there's all sorts of it. So you can see how it's systemic. It doesn't mean it's fair. It just means that there's multiple variables that are causing the consequence. Okay, so again, economic actions are not caused most of the time by intentional actions. It's mostly a series of multiple causes and effects in a systemic way. Okay? All right, so we talked about systemic causation, and now he's going to be talking about complexity. Okay? And I like this. This is actually a really good, I think it's a very interesting way of putting it. That just because an explanation for an economic action is simple doesn't necessarily mean that the ramifications are simple. So he gives an example of this obvious fact that people buy more at lower prices and that producers make more at higher prices. right? So that kind of fundamental aspect that produces what price that we pay in a free society. The fact that that is a simple phenomenon doesn't mean that its ramifications are simple. In fact, they have tremendous complexity in terms of the ramifications that they have. Okay? So, again, just because something seems obvious doesn't mean that it's not complex. And I think that this is a problem with a lot of politicians who want to try to solve problems by just, I don't know, passing a law about it. Okay? Um, so just because an explanation is simple doesn't mean that the ramifications are simple. Okay, so next he would say that there's a difference between individual and systemic rationality. All right, so there's a problem with attributing actions to personal causation as opposed to examining the incentives that exist within a system to behave in a certain way. And so he says, you might kind of be frustrated with a bureaucracy that tends to, this is on page 70, that tends to be slow and not be responsive to public opinion and be more concerned about the bureaucrats' job security as opposed to actually doing the mission that the bureaucracy was created for. He says that this is on page top of 71, where a policy or institution has been established by top political leaders, officials subject to their authority may well hesitate to contradict their beliefs, much less point out the counterproductive consequences that later follow from those policies and institutions. Messengers carrying bad news could be risking their careers, or, if it's under a tyrant like Stalin or Mao, their lives. I'll give you for instance, and this is a Soviet Union example. This is an example right out of our coronavirus crisis. So at the very, very beginning, there was actually some testing that was going on that coming out of the state of Washington because they had a senior citizen center and also a cruise boat that was highly infected with people with coronavirus. And there was actually some people on the ground at a regional office of the Center for Disease Control that wanted to do kind of a different style of testing and also a different form of treatment. And they sent this request to the Center for Disease Control, which is a bureaucracy. And because of the rules that were set into place, they had to kind of double check, triple check, quadruple check whether that decision was actually valid or not. Now, you can see why maybe there's some concern about this because maybe you don't want somebody going off half-cocked and making a decision without having it be reviewed. But the fact is that if that office in Spokane, or I think it was outside of Seattle, would have been allowed to do what they wanted to do, we still would have had the coronavirus, but we would have been able to actually start testing much, much earlier. And maybe we would have been able to actually have a much milder type of closure because of it. Okay, now of course there's a lot of other what ifs, and increasingly it looks like it really was an issue in China with this laboratory and people getting sick, and then the Chinese government really, I think it's just a horrible, horrible. Talk about morality, a terribly immoral decision that they didn't shut down their system because I think they feared. They wanted to kind of keep it a secret, but no. What ends up happening? This one laboratory in China shut down the entire global economy. It's kind of unprecedented when you think about it. Anyway, the problem there is that CDC employee in Washington D.C. Was actually acting rationally given the incentives of a bureaucratic system. The problem is it's the incentives of the bureaucratic system, not necessarily the person's operating within it. Okay. All right. So here, the problem is not personal. Often it's incentives that exist within the system. So one way of thinking about that is you better get a system that operates with some good incentives. All right. Speaking of incentives, he distinguishes an incentive from a goal. So, for example, we all want, or I think most people would agree, that we all want to have healthcare cost less, okay? And the prices that we pay for healthcare to be more affordable, okay?
Can you make this?
Sure.
All the ingredients are out.
Thank you. So the difference between an incentive and a goal is that incentives matter because most people will usually do something for their own benefit as opposed for the benefit of others. Now that seems maybe unfair, it might seem selfish, but it's actually taking into account human nature. And if you remember Adam Smith, there was the whole point that it's not the benevolence of the butcher and the baker and the brewer that we get our dinner. It's because of self-interest. Okay, so having a goal of affordable housing or health care is different than producing it absent specific incentives. So the question is not that that we have a goal of reducing the price of health care. What it really means is that do we have proper incentives for maybe making healthcare cheaper? So there's also this law of unintended consequences where you try to have price controls. He uses the example of this is on page 73. Hunger in India in the 17th century, in Italy, 18th century in France, Russia in the early 20th century, and then after the 1960s in Africa. All used price controls to try to deal with some real significant problems, and the result was actually the exact opposite of what they wanted to accomplish. So again, back to this kind of fundamental difference between a command system and a price system. Both of them face scarcity. That's just the world that we live in. We have scarce resources, and both have to make decisions within that reality of scarcity. One system, the price system, has individuals making choices for herself. The other system involves a small number of people making choices for millions of others. And the choice really is between choices made by individuals and choices made by those who presume to know the preferences of individuals. Okay. He talks next about scarcity and competition. And so, in some way, prices are self-rationing. Okay, because you have a certain amount, you have a limited amount of resources, and so if the price is high, then I'm gonna self-ration. I'm not gonna buy that thing because I can't afford it. All right. What that does is that it creates less social and political friction, he argues, and it limits an individual's claims on the outputs of others. Price controls, on the other hand, through a command system, reduces the incentive for self-rationing. You saw that in rent control in apartments. And so there's other types of rationing that happens in a command system, non-price rationing, like lines, waiting for an elective procedure in healthcare, luck, being the first one there, or corruption. All right. So basically, prices allow us to self-ration, and that's a very, very important point that he makes. A couple more concepts. Incremental substitution. He says that a price-coordinated economy facilitates incremental substitution. So instead of having to choose one or the other, health or let's say tourism, you can have more health or less tourism, but not one or the other. And if you think about the closure of the economy or the health of our citizens in the coronavirus, that's a very fundamental choice. A price system says You don't have to have an either or situation. A command coordinated economy tends toward categorical priorities, one or the other. All right, and because value is subjective, not objective, that incremental way of substituting one preference for another allows us, in some ways, to kind of have our cake and eat it too. And the question becomes, at what cost do you have certain things? And I think that's kind of what we're starting to get at when you're talking about what's the cost of having, you know, one less person get sick versus 100 people lose their jobs. Is that worth the cost? And that's a question that a price system, as opposed to a command system, will allow us. It's not perfect, but he would argue that it allows you to make that decision a whole lot better. All right, a couple more. So one thing that subsidies and taxes do is it hides what the real cost of a product is. Uses the case of water in California, where farmers pay for water, the same amount of water, $15, let's say, for, I don't know, gallons of water, versus $400 a gallon if you're a business in Los Angeles. Same thing happens in India. And so they're trying to actually encourage agriculture for food production, which is, obviously a good thing. But what ends up happening is that the price that you pay for water, the price that you pay for an agricultural good, isn't really accounting for the real cost of that water, and ends up misallocating resources. And if you live in California, they have a massive water shortage, and I think it's going to end up creating a real problem. It already is, and it's going to create a worse one. Okay, so this has to do with subsidies and taxes. They make it hard to determine the real cost of goods and services. All right, two more. The meaning of costs. So he would say that there's actually often a confusion between prices and costs. So when someone says, I want to reduce the cost of health care, and they don't really think about what the inputs of that would be, how much it costs to train a doctor, how much it costs to develop medicine, how much it costs to purchase medical technology, how much does it cost to build, think about all these new hospital beds that are being produced in gymnasiums to help with the coronavirus. All those things are factors that you have to account for in order to determine what a price of a particular product is. So when we say we're reducing costs of healthcare, what they're really saying is that they're trying to reduce the price that consumers pay for particular services, but the cost of those services are not going to go away just because the government waves a wand and passes a law. So what ends up happening is that price controls fail because they don't pay the full costs of a particular item. And you either have a situation where you have rent control, where you have shortages, or you have price supports for agriculture, and you get overages, basically surpluses. Okay. And finally, he talks about what the value of prices are overall for an economy. And what he says there is that they convey information about underlying realities. And then they provide incentives to respond to those realities, whether something has a high price or a low price. There's so many factors that are caused by that particular phenomenon. And so just by looking at that price, it's gonna send signals and information that are much more valuable and much more easy for someone to actually understand than having to kind of do all the research that would require if you work for some kind of government bureau to determine how many ventilators you need. Okay. Now that doesn't mean that sometimes you don't have to kind of intervene if there's an emergency or something, but overall, do you want the normal way of an economy operating under a price system or a command system? He says that because knowledge is very scarce, prices play a role in economizing on the amount of knowledge required for any decision making. So to economize is to kind of use your resources wisely. And if knowledge and information is scarce, then you need something that will help you kind of make quick decisions without having to kind of pore over a lot of data. And that's what prices do. And the other alternative in a command system is to kind of put all these smart people together in a room and try to kind of pore over these complex factors and then make a decision about how to make a camera lens. And he uses the example of a camera lens. And he says on page 84, he says, after all, glass is not used only in camera lenses, but in microscopes, telescopes, windows, mirrors, and innumerable other things. To know how much glass should be allocated to the production of each of those many products would require more expertise in more complex subjects than any individual or any manageable size group can be expected to master. So at the end of the day, this is a complex word, but it's epistemological. People are not smart enough to do that, but they can understand if something is more or less expensive, and that's what the beauty of prices are. It's not perfect, but when you're comparing it to a command system, it's much, much better. And that's what we need moving forward to understand other economic phenomenon, to understand this fundamental difference between a price system and a command system. And that's what he wants you to know, and that's what we just did. Okay? So what we'll do on Wednesday is we'll just talk about this whole issue of price, and so we can have a better understanding of it. And hopefully maybe we can talk about what the impact is of all of these price controls that government tries to do. Okay? With that, that's the end, and hopefully we'll have a good discussion tomorrow, Wednesday. Thank you.